Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Healing Home. I'm your host, Michelle, and today I am joined by Mike Williams of Sage of Quay Radio. I am very, very excited to have you today, Mike. Thank you so much for being here, and how's your day going so far?
So far, so good. And thank you for the invite, Michelle.
Yes, you're very welcome. And I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself for people who may not be familiar with your work, because I have been following your work for many years since I began my journey with quote unquote truther information. But typically, when I started digging into Charles Manson, the mythos of all of that, probably back in around 2013, when my whole paradigm just exploded, when I started learning about the truth behind the history of bands like the Beatles, the Doors, Neil Young, what was happening in the 60s. We could go on, but please introduce yourself for the people who may not be familiar with your work and let them know where they can find you as well.
Okay, so I've been at this a pretty long time. I started off as a blogger going back to the 2011, 2012 timeframe, and I still run the blog, Michelle. It's been what now, 12, 13 years. I've had to change the URL a couple of times because of censorship, but it's still there. And then in 2014, I started doing podcasting and I created a YouTube channel and I had never podcasted before. And two people who helped me get started were Max Egan and David Icke, believe it or not. So going back to 2014, the early part of 2014, a friend of mine had David Icke's email. And so I sent David an email and I asked him if he wouldn't mind coming on my show. I was nobody. He didn't know me from a hole in the wall. And about a week later, David responded and said, "Okay, I'll come on your show." And it was the same thing with Max Egan. I was listening to a lot of Max's podcasts, and I thought, let me invite Max and see if he'll come on. And the same thing happened. So I want to thank both David and Max for helping me get started. It was very beneficial because what happened was after people saw their names, whenever I reached out to somebody, they were more apt to come on the show because it had like a track record of having people on. So, I mean, that's how it works. Some people may not like that, but that's reality. That's how it works. So, I have been doing the YouTube channel and now Rumble and Odyssey and Brighteon and BitChute since 2014. So that's a decade. And my podcasting, where I was the host, actually slowed up a lot once I got into the Beatle research, which was in 2016. I was still doing shows after that, but the research into the Beatles was occupying so much of my time that I had to shift gears. So since 2016, I've been heads down looking into the Beatles and what they were really all about. And I came up with some very interesting conclusions.
Yeah, great intro. And that's wonderful to hear about. I have heard you speak about that, your intro with Max Egan and David Icke. It's so cool when we look back at those things and look at those people who were the ones that were like, I'll give them a chance, and then that being the catapult
Yeah.
person that allows you into that little network. And I think too, it is unfortunate that it is who you know, but that's just how it goes.
That's
And
how it is.
it'll always be that way, and it's okay. And it's like you can hate on it or you can try and shun it all you want, but the more you do that too, you close yourself off to all these opportunities. So it's really cool. Well, I'm grateful that you stepped on this path, because I've learned a lot from your research, as has my fiance Mario, and we both have just really enjoyed what you come out with, and that's why you're here today. So I'm really pumped to get into the Beatles, because with the Beatles, once you start looking into their history, it's really hard to deny, unless you have your fan cap on and you're unable to take that off. It's really hard to deny that their career is definitely Interesting to say the least, because the amount of records that have come out, the amount of studio time they've had, the amount of songs that were written in about what, a 10-year period, they say. How in the hell is that even possible? And you, as a musician yourself, would know exactly what it takes in order to be putting out the amount of music that they have. So, what was the first thing that really tipped you off about the Beatles that you were like, I've got to dig deeper into this and figure out what's really going on here?
Well, what I should say first is I was a huge Beatle fan. I was a Beatle freak. I grew up with the Beatles. I begged my parents to go see Yellow Submarine in 1968. So my father took my brother and I to the theater. It's because of the Beatles that I picked up a guitar, started writing music, recording, all of that. I studied Beatle music. I would listen to what they recorded, the overdubs, and I would incorporate that into my ideas about a song. And I knew about the Paul is dead rumor or conspiracy going back to when I was in high school. That's when I really became familiar with it. And that was around 1976 or so. And I was so interested in the clues. I was playing records backwards and I was looking at the album covers, looking to pick up on the clues, that what I did back on Long Island, my high school was very progressive. And if the students wanted to bring a speaker in or a presenter, you could do that. You had to get it approved and all that stuff. So I thought, well, I'm going to bring my friend Adam's brother in, Doug. And Doug is he was 5 years older than us, but he knew all of the Beatle clues, everything, all the backmasking, all of the album clues. So I asked Doug, would he come in and do a presentation? So he said, yeah. So he came in, and I had put all these signs up advertising that we're going to have this Paul is dead clues presentation. And I didn't expect much. I really didn't. And so they set aside a classroom. So, Doug gets there a little early. He sets up. And by the time we're ready to start, it was packed. There was standing room only to listen to Doug present the clues and play the backmasking. So that was my introduction into it. I was really into it at the time. But like most people, I thought that the Paul is dead conspiracy or the rumors was nothing more than a marketing ploy to pump up more record sales. And the Beatles have always been sold to us as these clever, witty guys. And so it was a clever, witty thing that they did. And so for the longest time, I knew about the rumor, but I just said, no, there's no way. So then what happened in 2016, the early part of 2016, I was on Amazon and I was looking for books, and Amazon recommends this book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, which I knew nothing about. So I click on it and I read a little bit about the book. There's a little bit of a write-up. So I said, okay, well, this looks interesting. Let me take a look. It's about the Paul is dead conspiracy. And so I bought the book and I started reading it. And when I started reading it, I was just blown away, because it's a narrative that is 180 degrees apart from the official narrative. So everything that we were told about the Beatles from an official narrative perspective was completely turned on its head. So I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, oh, this is very strange. And the thing that caught my attention was there was so much detail in the book that I thought to myself, the only way this much information and detail can make its way into this book is it has to be written by somebody who is either part of the inner circle or the person that is playing the part of Paul McCartney. And so what I did was I started to break down what was presented in the book, the statements it was making. And I thought, well, let me go off and see if I can debunk what it's telling me in the book. Is it truthful or is it not truthful? So to make a long story short, over the years, I have found that although the book does have threads of fiction in it, it's classified as historical fiction, and it does that for plausible deniability. And that's because the person that's playing Paul McCartney, I refer to him as Billy Shears, he has signed contracts, NDAs, secrecy agreements to play this part. And so he can't completely spill the beans, but what he can do is to put information out there under the guise of historical fiction with plausible deniability, and then leave it up to the intrepid reader how far they want to go with the book. And it's a Masonic book. And what I mean by that is the author or the encoder is Thomas Hugh Harriot. And Tom is a Freemason. And Tom has the book layered. So there's various layers to the book. So what do I mean by that? It means you can just read the book as is, and you're going to get information from it. Then there's a piece of encoding that's called word stacking. So on each page of the book, there are bolded out letters. I should say bolded out words. Once you read those words, more of the story starts to come out. So there are sentences or narratives within the narrative. Then there's another layer that's called the acrostical code. So the acrostical code takes the first letter of every other sentence and forms additional sentences. So now you have more information. In 2018, Tom Hugh Harriot added footnotes. And the footnotes were placed in the book, I was told, because the person who's playing the part of Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, wanted the book to get more traction. He wanted more people to become aware of the book and to also break through some of the encoding or the coyness of the book. So you'll read certain sentences and you'll think to yourself, well, what exactly does that mean? And you'll have to sit and pause for a moment and think about it. But with the 2018 version, a lot of that guesswork was taken out because Tom added footnotes, which were very clear about what those particular passages or narratives were talking about in the book. Another piece of layering is the book asks the reader, if they decide to, like I said, be intrepid, to go outside the book and to do research, and then take your research outside the book and tie it back to where the book was leading you or suggesting that you go or look at. And that's what I did when I took a look at whether they wrote all their own music or not. Recently, there's another layer, and it's referred to as the whisper messages. So at the very top or the side of each page, or almost all of the pages, I don't think it's on every page of the book. The book is 666 pages and 66 chapters. So we have a little bit of occultism going on there. But these whisper messages are written in very faint font. So, I had to actually take a magnifying glass, as ridiculous as this sounds, and read the whisper messages. And now we're getting more information. So that's how the book works. So think of it, the way I've described it on other shows is think of it as a gigantic puzzle. And you're presented with this puzzle. And you put it together. And the more pieces that you're able to fit together, the more you're going to understand that what the book is telling us overall is truthful. There, like I said, there are threads of nonfiction. So part of the process is to figure out, well, which pieces of the book are the fictional aspects of the book versus the nonfiction. So what happened was, as I was going through this book and reading it, Sophia Smallstone was a friend of mine, and back in 2016, I told her, I've got this book. It's very interesting. I'm not really sure where to go with it, but I started to explain to her what the book was saying. And she said, well, why don't you come on my show and do a presentation on the book? And I resisted for the longest time, Michelle, because I the book is 666 pages, and I knew in order to break that book down, there was going to be a tremendous amount of work. Like I had to build a PowerPoint. I had to think through what are the categories, the subcategories, and tie it all out. And I thought to myself, do I really, really want to do this? So Sophia was very persistent, as she is. And finally, I said, fine, I'll do it. And so I went on her show in September of 2016. And I think we did 2.5 hours and we presented it. And I really thought that was going to be it. I really had no other plans to go any further with the book. I thought, okay, fine, I did it. Now let's move on. And then Mark Devlin reached out to me after watching the show I did with Sophia. And Mark said, hey, Mike, would you come on my show and talk about it? And I said, okay, I'll come on your show and talk about it. And toward the end of that show, I said to Mark, well, this is going to be the last interview I'm going to do on the Beatles and this book. And that's documented. That's kind of etched in stone and famous last words. And, it's just one of those things, Michelle. There's so much to it. There are so many touch points. And it goes deep into the agenda that we're seeing playing out today, which really started in earnest going back into the 1950s, but really in the 1960s with the counterculture. And the thing is, you don't realize that at first. And as I mentioned, when you put more and more of the pieces of the puzzle in place, you start to think to yourself, okay, all right, well, now, this leads back over here. And so then you go take a look over here, and another piece of the story starts to emerge. And so here I am in 2024, 8 years into this, and still talking about it and still looking into it. I did say on a show I did with Billy Watson recently that I think that I may wrap it up maybe next year. Right now, we're in a very early stages, concept phase of a documentary that Jay Widener asked me to help him with on the Beatles' unofficial story. And so I'm working on the outline right now as we speak for that documentary. And I also had to reach out to some of my colleagues to see if they were interested in participating. I didn't want the documentary to be me because there are other researchers out there that have done fabulous work. Many of them are colleagues and friends of mine. And I wanted them to present their material as well because I didn't want it to be the Mike show. Because to be the Mike show, well, somebody can just interview me, or I can put a presentation together myself and put it up on my platforms and do it that way. So maybe next year I might ride out into the sunset, but every time I say that, something else pops up. But in any case, that's the background. The book, what happens is you start with the replacement of Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney was swapped out at the end of 1966. There are 3 dates you're going to come across. August, some researchers will say it was August after their concert at Candlestick Park. The book tells us unequivocally it was September 11th of 1966. That's the date I lean toward because of its occult significance. Others will say that it was November 9th, which is the inverse of September 11th. But I'll go with the book because the book is very emphatic. The date is September 11th. And then what happens is once you figure out that Paul was indeed swapped out, then you start down the path, well, why? Why did that happen? Why was it done in secrecy? And what was the story leading up to September 11th of 1966? See, what a lot of researchers do, and I'm not knocking them because this is an important piece. It is important to understand that Paul was swapped out, that he was replaced. But to start there and only move forward is only playing half the football field. there's a whole lot that took place before that, as in, why were the Beatles created?
Right.
How did they come about? What was their purpose? So, and that's the piece I got into. And that's the piece that gets me into a lot of hot water with fans, other researchers, because a lot of researchers, although, like I said, they've done some very good work, they don't want to touch that piece of the story because they still love what I refer to as the Cinderella story.
Mm.
Four lads from Liverpool, they connect with Brian Epstein, who's a record store manager, owner, and then he's able to get them a recording contract with EMI under the tutelage of George Martin, and then they go on to unprecedented fame and fortune. I mean, that's a fabulous story. Who doesn't like it? I loved it for the longest time. But as I dug in, um, that story is exactly that. It's a story. And there's a lot of other information and a lot of other pieces to that puzzle that a lot of people don't know about or pay attention to, or if they hear it, it goes right over their heads because the official narrative is so indoctrinated that anything that cuts across the grain is just set aside. And we have to remember, as of today in 2024, the Beatles' official narrative has been around for 60 years. That's a long time to have something constantly pounded into your head. So anyway, long-winded, but there you go.
No, it's beautiful. I love it. I'm here for it, man. And okay, so one of the things that I think about, well, first off, I have to say whisper messages. I've never even heard of that term in a book. So
Right.
now it makes me think about how many other books out there have these whisper messages in there. And so you can see it with your plain eyes, but it's like wispy and small.
Very light font. Very light
Wow.
font. And Tom put them in the book um, as another layer. And also, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but there's a very esoteric story behind the Beatles. Very esoteric, which goes over the heads of a lot of people because they don't know anything about the esoteric or mysticism or
Right.
Aleister Crowley and Thelema. And honestly, that's exactly how the controllers want it. They don't want people to know about this. And we'll get into this as I um, talk some more. But the Beatles are tied back to cultural Marxism and the Frankfurt School,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about that.
Yes. Wow. Well, hey, okay. So, what do you think was presented to the other members when they swapped out Paul for Billy? How do you think that went down? Or were they even unaware? Was it like, what's your opinion on that?
Well, they were aware, and I'll take you through my opinion on how it went down. The person that replaced Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, he has the primary contract. There have been doubles and lookalikes, and Billy mentions in the book that there was another person who played the role of Paul McCartney that had a hit, but he doesn't say whether it's a Beatle hit or it's post Beatles as Paul McCartney, as in the solo career. So I believe, based upon my research, reading the book, taking a look how I believe things would work logically, Billy has been involved in the band for a long time, going back to, I believe, its inception as early as 1962. In the book, he tells us that he was a studio musician, and one of his skills was vocal mimicry. So he would be hired to come in and sing like famous singers. If that particular singer couldn't make the session, maybe they were not feeling well, voice wasn't doing well, they would call Billy in to go do the vocals. So I believe he was part of the equation the whole time. I believe in all likelihood, I think there's a high probability that he was one of the studio musicians that was uh, on the Beatles recordings, whether he was he's a horn, a wind, I should say, a wind and keyboard piano player by trade.
Okay.
Okay. But he's a multi-instrumentalist, so he can obviously play guitar, play bass. And so when George Martin was pulling together the Beatles songs, and then, well, the songs written for the Beatles, and then bring in the studio musicians, I'm convinced that Billy was a constant in those sessions. So whether he was playing in the orchestra, or he was playing some wind instrument, the piano, guitar, bass, or whatever, he was there. So the reason why I'm taking you through this is because if that's the case, and I believe it is, then the other Beatles knew who he was. So he wasn't this stranger that just popped in September of 1966. So he was making the rounds through different studios, EMI being one of them as a studio musician. And I do believe that George Martin tapped him to play on certain songs. So the other thing that we have to get our heads wrapped around, and I had to do this as well, all of the Beatles were Freemasons. So how do we know this? Because we can go back in time and we can see multitudes of images and photos that were taken of the Beatles, whether as a group or individually, where they are engaged in Masonic symbolism. The Masonic handshake, the lion's paw, one-eyed symbolism, lots and lots of imagery. Birdcage, the birdcage goes to Illuminati mind control. We can get into that a little bit. So this is important because if the Beatles were Freemasons, and I believe they were, that's a secret society that keeps its secrets to itself. Now, some people will argue, well, they weren't high degree Masons at that age, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. And that's probably the case, but it doesn't matter because Masons have obligations. They take their oaths and they're bound by those oaths, period. So I think that when Paul was replaced, and I do lean toward Paul passing away, dying. Other people believe that he just stepped out. I don't see any proof of that, to be honest with you. I've taken a look at many, many, many images post 1966, and I haven't really come across anything that wasn't doctored that looks like the original biological Paul. So I believe Paul did pass away in 1966. So when it came time to keep the Beatles together, and Billy was brought in again. Now, Billy wasn't just dragged off the streets and said, hey, you look like him, you play like him, you sound like him, because this is kind of the questions you get from those that don't believe the story or don't want to believe it. Oh, how did they find somebody that looked like him, sounded like him, and plays like him? Well, the truth of the matter is none of those things are true. He doesn't look like Paul. He really doesn't sing like Paul.
Right.
And he's a different instrumentalist than Paul. He has a different style of playing than Paul did. The only reason why people believe that he looks like him, he sounds like him, he plays like him, and all that, it goes back to what I said before. He's been Paul McCartney for 60 years. That's who you're used to seeing. That's who you are used to hearing. And so he's Paul McCartney. As an example, just to give the audience a kind of a baseline, take a look at early video of biological Paul pre-1966 going back to 62 and 63 performing live. And take a look at how Paul plays his bass, his stance, his body movements. Fast forward to the rooftop scene in Get Back in January of 1969 and take a look at that guy and notice his posture and his stance when he's playing. It's completely different. not even remotely the same. They are two different people. So the Beatles were well aware that they were manufactured and that they had a job to do. Now, their understanding of the big picture was limited. It's compartmentalized.
Right.
Okay, so that's not to say that they had the full spectrum or the full scope of where the controllers were going with all this. But they knew they had a role, they knew they had a part, they knew they were trained to do this role. And a lot of that training goes back to Hamburg. We'll talk about that if we have time, what Hamburg was all about. So when Paul departed, I'm going to assume there was a discussion that said the show must go on.
Right.
And the new guy is that guy that you guys have seen hanging around here. Okay. And possibly working with George Martin, even before 1967 and with Sergeant Pepper, because Sergeant Pepper was really the George Martin and Billy Shears show. That was their baby. So that's what I think happened. And it's not to say that the original Beatles were not mourning or upset about the fact that Paul died and Paul was replaced. They just couldn't really go anywhere with it. And although there were clues that were dropped by each individual Beatle over the course of time, especially in their solo careers. So John Lennon released a song on the Imagine album, How Do You Sleep? How Do You Sleep is the quintessential Paul is Dead song. And if you read memoirs and then you go listen to John's song, How Do You Sleep? There's direct linkages. The song and the book map. Ringo Starr did a song, Back Off Boogaloo. Now, the book tells us that the Beatles used to call Billy Boogaloo because he liked that genre of music. So when Ringo is singing Back Off Boogaloo, he's singing Back Off Billy. Because Billy, in the book, if people read it, you'll understand that he's very driven. His work ethic is just go, 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 and he's a perfectionist. This is not something that the other Beatles were, they were not used to working that way. And we'll get into the music in a bit. The Beatles' music from 62 through 66 in particular, I concluded based upon my research, they wrote very little, if any, of that music, which means the songs were written for them, which means George Martin then brought in studio musicians, and we could talk about Rubber Soul, because Rubber Soul, in my opinion, is the silver bullet that really puts the cap on this. So studio musicians recorded the songs, and so when the Beatles came into the studio, their job was not to write music. Their job was not to record the music because the songs were already written and recorded. Their job was to sing the vocals. That was their job. That's a very, very different job than being involved in the actual songwriting, in the arrangement of a song, than putting it all together. So when Billy came into the picture, starting with the recording of Sgt. Pepper, what he did was he brought them more into the fold, whereas George Martin kept everything basically to outside songwriters and studio musicians. When Billy came in, he wanted to open that up to John Lennon and George Harrison in particular, so that they could be participate more in the songwriting and play more on the recorded tracks. So think of Billy as actually developing them to become songwriters, or much better songwriters, and to also play on the recorded tracks. Now, that being said, the Billy period goes from 1967 to 1970. The biological Paul period is 62 through 66. even though Billy brought them into the fold. And this is, in my opinion, this is particularly evident with the White Album.
Mm.
Because Pepper, Sergeant Pepper was the Billy and George Martin show. Pepper was very, very important because Sergeant Pepper kicked off the Summer of Love. It was the beginning, the true beginning of the psychedelic period. So the Beatles established that foundation, that baseline. In fact, in an interview, I believe it was in 1990, Billy, as Paul McCartney, sat down and had an interview with Bernie Goldberg. And during that interview, Billy told Bernie that George Harrison was essentially a no-show for the Sgt. Pepper recording sessions. That George Harrison was at home putting in a pool or something. That's a quote from the interview. So why am I bringing that up? I'm bringing that up because that's to show that George Harrison was credited for the guitar work on the Sgt. Pepper album. But here we have an interview with Billy speaking to Bernie Goldberg and saying, well, George Harrison wasn't there. So it begs the question, well, if George wasn't there, then who's playing guitar on those tracks? My guess is a lot of it was done by Billy himself. And of course, they can always bring in a studio guitar player and then credit the tracks back to George Harrison. But it's with the White Album that we start to really get this eclectic collection of songs. And a lot of people, a lot of Beatle fans and critics will say it's a great album, but it's a hodgepodge of styles.
Yep.
It's eclectic.
And particularly for the time, because,
Yes.
And that is always a big giveaway. And I'm glad we're going to the White Album because it obviously brings us closer even to like the Manson mythos that is mixed in with all of this.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of my interest lies within Manson. And I'm of the belief too that the Beatles were thrown into the Manson mix as kind of this weird sort of, that's the mainstream narrative. Okay. They were listening to the Beatles and they were influenced by the White Album. And that's why they wrote Helter Skelter. And that's why there's Piggies and this and that. I do think that that's part of the whole kind of CIA sort of MK Ultra underlyingness of the Manson stuff, but it just always just interests me that these two blend together so well because just that whole thing of the times of the Beatles kind of like ushering in the Summer of Love, and then you have the Beatles kind of bringing it to the close because in my opinion the Manson murders were kind of the quintessential close of the Summer of Love. You talk to people, even I can remember talking to my grandparents about how it felt, and they lived in Wisconsin, not in LA, but how everyone locked their doors after this period of time and everything else. So that's just something that's coming to mind that I want to throw into the mix with the White Album anyway.
Yeah, in the book, Billy distances himself and the band from Manson. Just so people know that. So I do think that the Beatles and the Manson story were glued together by the controllers. That to create a narrative, like you said, Michelle. So in any case, so what we have from 67 to 70, where Billy is the de facto handler, manager, leader of the band, is the Beatles writing more of their own stuff, playing more on the recorded tracks. However, ghostwriters were still being used to fill out the material for an album, and session musicians were still being used. As an example, one of the songs that I point out that just does not sound like the Beatles at all, and it just sounds like a crack team of session players, is Lady Madonna.
Interesting.
Okay. Also on the White Album, we'll talk a bit about Theodore Adorno and the Frankfurt School, but on the White Album, if we listen, another example that I put out there for folks to listen to is to show a song that was, in all likelihood, written by George Harrison and credited to him, and another song that was written for George Harrison and credited to him. Two different things. One he wrote, one he didn't, but the credits go to him. If you listen to the song Long, 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 I can listen to that song and I can think to myself, I could easily get comfortable with saying George penned that song. He wrote that song. It's not overly complicated. In fact, I think the song is a little draggy, not one of my favorite songs, but be that as it may, because there are good, look, liking music is very subjective. There are going to be people that are going to say, Mike, you're crazy. I love that song. But then switch over to Piggies. And you have this Baroque, it's orchestral, and the lyrics are right down Theodore Adorno's avenue, right down the thought processes of the Frankfurt School of critical theory and cultural Marxism. Now, did George write that song? No, I don't think so. I think that song was, in all likelihood, composed by Theodore Adorno, both the music and the lyrics, and George got to sing the song. So we'll get more into this, and I'll explain more why that is meaningful. But the takeaway at this point is that the Beatles, the story, is so different than what we have been told. Very, very different. Because we were told that they were these brilliant, genius songwriters. They were prolific, great musicians, even though they themselves have never said they were great musicians. That's the interesting thing. That's one of the most interesting pieces of this whole thing. The story has gotten its own legs where people will say the Beatles were brilliant musicians. But then if you go back to interviews that, especially Paul McCartney was brutally honest in two interviews going back to 1966. In June of 1966 at the Hilton in Japan, and in a BBC interview that he did with John Lennon at his house on August 5th of 1966, the day that Revolver was released, their seventh studio album. And in those interviews, Paul says, we never claimed to be great musicians. We're limited as a group. At the Hilton, he said, we're adequate. We're adequate musicians. So that's an example of how the band itself was putting the truth out in front of everybody and saying, look, we're not great musicians. We're adequate at best. We're limited. But then the mythos is that they are these spectacular, great musicians, creative geniuses. So there's a lot of stuff like that. We'll get into it, I guess, I hope, when we talk about George Martin and George Martin's impressions of the band when he first met them back in 1962. A lot of George's statements were not very flattering. And these things that George said in interviews, it's out there in the public domain. They're out there. It's not secret stuff, but people disregard it. Anytime it cuts across the grain, it cuts across the official narrative or the Cinderella story. It's like these programs that run that filter that stuff out and says, does not compute.
Right.
Does not. Danger, danger, Will Robinson. Don't listen to that Mike Williams. Don't listen to George Martin in that interview, right? So there's a lot of stuff like that. We have time, like I said, I'll take you through an article that was written in New Music Express back in 1971, where they interviewed their engineer for their first 6 albums, Norman Smith. The things that Norman said were not very flattering.
I hope you're enjoying this current episode with Mike Williams. Wanted to pop in really quick, you guys, to let you know that I still have some of my mugwort skincare products available. I have my Earthy Glow facial oil, my mugwort Earth Hag soap, and my mugwort and rose facial toner. All 3 of these have really been lovely, and I really worked hard to correspond with Venus for this offering. I went with the Venus correspondence of mugwort to harness that beauty, that lusciousness, that just wonderful earthy energy that comes from mugwort. It is heavily infused into these products along with the love of Venus and my love for mugwort. You can feel it in these products and it really goes a long way. And if you're wanting to nourish and love your skin, this is a really great way to do it. So head to michelleshealinghome.com, head to the store tab, and you can get your hands on some of these remedies. Now, back to the show.
I don't know. So I don't want to bog your show down here with some of this minutia. Is there anything anywhere in particular you wanted to go?
I mean, no, you're not bogging it down at all, really. And so I guess to me, I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the current threads that you're pulling at with this? So you've been researching this for many years. Is there anything right now that is like an updated information that you're coming across, or new conclusions that you're finding about with this information, or what, anything else like that?
The information today is, in my opinion, validating my conclusions or my thoughts on what the Beatles were all about. So if we go back in time and we talk about the Frankfurt School working with Tavistock,
Mm-hmm.
and before that we had the Fabian Society. So we had this cultural Marxism within the elite mindset that converged. And that convergence took place under Tavistock, the Tavistock Institute.
Yeah, let's go into this a little bit, because I know a lot of people out there will probably be familiar with Tavistock, or at least they've heard of it. But let's talk a little bit about how big of a role this plays in everything, and not only the Beatles, but let's jump into that side of it.
Okay, so the best place to start is to understand that the elite ideology is one that says that they know better, that they need to control humanity, because humanity left to its own devices will fall flat on its face. They refer to us as being profane. They look at us as not very intelligent, not very smart. We're not intellectuals. This is the elite mindset. And this elite mindset comes under the umbrella of Freemasonry. So think of Freemasonry as the overarching entity that underneath it contains a federation of secret societies that all work together. So that means that there's a Jesuit control system. There's obviously a Masonic control system. There's a Rosicrucian control system. There is a Jewish control system. There are Templars from the Knights Templar. They all work in conjunction with each other. And many of them belong to different secret societies as well. So what they have undertaken, and it's been in place for a very, very long time. And by the way, my research has shown me that it goes back to the Egyptian mysteries and the Egyptian mythology of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set. It goes back to Babylon, back to the priesthood and the Babylonian mysteries. But it also goes back to other mythologies, such as going back to Greece and Rome. In John Coleman's book, in the Committee of 300, he tells us that the committee, which is comprised of elites, some of them coming from the families of the black nobility, which trace their roots back to ancient Rome. They refer to themselves as the Olympians, the gods. So this is the position that they place themselves. So they have dominion over us. This is how they think. And this is how they operate. This is their ideology. So we have to understand that. So what they're looking to do is to implement a socialist, Marxist world order. So when we talk about the New World Order, the one world government, that's what they're looking to do. And it's pagan based. If you read John Coleman's book on Freemasonry, he tells us that the Masons want nothing to do with Christianity, even though they will play the game that they are accepting of Christianity and the Holy Bible is in their lodge. They are anti-Christian, as are, if not maybe all of these secret societies that I was just talking about, because they're pagan based. And when I talk about this, Michelle, and to the audience, I'm not anti-pagan. I'm not anti-Christian. When I talk about this stuff, I'm putting it within the context of my research. So just take it at that level. I'm not being pro-Christian. I'm not being pro-pagan or anti-Christian or anti-pagan. It just is what it is based upon what I've researched. So they're looking for this, they will tell us that they're looking for this altruistic, egalitarian world where everything is equal, everything is good. There's no more war, there's no more poverty, there's none of that stuff. We're going to save the environment. I look at this and I think to myself, well, are they really being altruistic? Are they really egalitarian? Or are they gaslighting us? Okay. They're gaslighting us because we have to understand that the very system that they are telling us is of no use is a system that they created. Okay. So they built the mousetrap. And what do I mean by that? So they're responsible for the Industrial Revolution that took place back in England in the 1700s. And then they had the American Industrial Revolution that kicked off in the 1800s. It went through, the war up through around 1940 and 1945. So they built a system that they knew was going to dominate people's lives, that people were going to depend on. So as an example, what's a good example of this? Many, many years ago, there were lots of small shops, sole proprietors, entrepreneurs, small business owners. They're very methodical in what they do. In fact, the Fabians are the poster child for this. They do things very incrementally, very methodically, so that you are unaware that these things are taking place. It's like the boiling frog phenomena.
Right.
Okay. So think about it. So they create the corporate structure. And if we go back to the March 2020 event, what they did was they moved a disproportionate number of people, employment-wise, into their corporate matrix. So they shut down small businesses, they shut down sole proprietors. They've been doing this for a very long time. In fact, I remember reading reports years ago where federal loans for small businesses were not going to small businesses. They were funneling that money off to the big corporations, the multinational corporations. They didn't want to develop small business because they didn't want independence. They didn't want people to be resilient, resourceful, and individuals. So the mousetrap was, we're going to build this industrial base. People are going to go work in our factories. They're going to go work in our corporations. And at some point, we're going to be able to leverage that. One of the ways they leveraged it was with C19. I don't know if this is going on YouTube, so I'll use code words.
Yeah, perfect. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Because they knew now that even though we still had people in small businesses and so on, a huge portion of the population worked in their system, in the corporate system, and they could put the mandates through. And they could tell you, if you don't do this, you don't pick up a paycheck. So think about this in terms of a lot of stuff that has taken place. Because people will ask me, they'll say, well, you know, why would they tear down this system? Because it doesn't matter to them. They're here. They have their wealth and control no matter what. No matter what system is in place, they're calling the shots. Ultimately, what they're looking to do is to bring the entire world back into the feudal system. And I've been saying this for a long time. The feudal system never went away. It just got more technically advanced.
Mm.
So if you don't think you live in the feudal system, think about the fact that your taxes, you're being taxed all the time for everything. And if you're not getting taxed, well, you're getting surcharges. And
Yep.
there are registration fees. They're always trying to steal your wealth. Always. So if we go back in time, we have the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School engaged in what was called critical theory. And we had Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. They were the four primary players with the Frankfurt School. And they were looking to implement cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is different than Lenin Marxism. Think of Karl Marx as he's the theoretician. Then you have Lenin Marxism, which believed in using force to make change. The Bolsheviks in Russia as an example. And in fact, after World War I, the Bolsheviks were convinced that the workers were going to stand up. I don't know if people remember this, but the old slogan for communism was "Workers unite with the fist." Well, the workers didn't unite, and so they had to go back to the drawing board and figure out what the heck is going on here. This was supposed to ignite, a revolution, and it didn't. So you bring in the Frankfurt School, and their attitude was, you got it all wrong, okay? You can't just go in and use force and violence to make these things happen, because there are going to be repercussions. What you have to do is you have to subvert from within. You have to penetrate their institutions. And from there, you change their laws, or you disregard their laws. And now what you're doing is your revolution now is slow and methodical, but over time, you're going to change it. So critical theory, the way I explain it is, what Adorno and Max Horkheimer and Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse were doing was they were taking a look at the existing structures in society. And they would then be critical of it. They would criticize it and say, well, that's not really good. You think it's good, right? Yeah, I think this is fine. As an example, the mother staying home with the children, being the homekeeper.
Yep.
Dad goes off to work, right? Critical theory would turn around and say, why are you as a woman accepting that role? Don't you understand that's a patriarchal role that has been put upon you? It's been imposed on you. Nothing says that you need to do that. So we need to have women's rights, the women's movement, to pull the woman out of the house, out of the home, away from the children, into careers. And so when that happened, then the children, what are you going to do with the children? Now the children have to go someplace. They have to go to daycare or preschool or after school. In other words, they become wards of the state in a way. So that when I look at critical theory, those were the types of things that they were doing. Whereas many moms and women who had children were, hey, I'm okay traditionally to stay home, take care of the children, take care of the household, as the father, the man, went off to work. A big thing with the Frankfurt School was they were always dumping on the male, the masculine aspect of society. They called it the patriarchy. Oh, do away with the patriarchy. The world would be a better place if it was more feminine. Now, I'm not saying that the matriarchal aspects of a woman doesn't have obviously good character traits and things that we could bring in, and that would make the world a better place. But it's a balance, right? It's a balance.
Yes.
And it's up to each individual to make a decision as to how they want to operate their household. But what they were trying to do was, no, they don't want you making that decision. What they wanted was to just turn the switch and switch it. Get the mother out of the house. Get both parents out working. The children then would be, like I said, wards of the state, because somebody had to watch them if mom and dad were at home. So that's just one example of critical theory. Here's a quote from Max Horkheimer, who was one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, and he's talking about the Marxist revolution, cultural Marxism. The revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move toward universal egalitarianism. That's what they're looking for. Now, as a precursor to the Beatles, coming out of the Frankfurt School, we had the Beat movement. Okay? So we had William S. Burroughs, Ray Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg. Now, the one thread that we're going to see with Frankfurt and with Tavistock is there are two threads that I have picked up on. There's a psychoanalytic thread. There's a psychology thread. How to manipulate the mind. And then the other thread is hedonism. So the hedonistic part of this is to go after traditional values, traditional family values, to go after institutionalized religion. And a big, big blip on their radar was Christianity. Because like I said, if you read Coleman's book, the Freemasons want nothing to do with Christianity. They want it out of the way. In fact, in his book, he mentions that at the 26th degree of Freemasonry, that is when the Mason is told that their God is Lucifer. Up to that point, all you had to do was to have a belief in a God, a creator, source. So that's how they kind of bring it along. But I believe it was the 26th degree that John Coleman mentions that they're told, okay, so, I mean, here's the punchline. Lucifer is our God. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So now, so you have the whole Beat movement, and it's B-E-A-T, the Beat movement. And what the Beat movement was all about was, it was about no rules. It was about cultural change. It was about hedonistic behavior, ad-libbing, freestyling, not to be bound by laws, societal norms, which they claimed were just, they didn't mean anything. Your idea of good is maybe not my idea of good. So there was kind of this moral equivalency argument that was taking place as well. Right. So that's what they were doing. And I read that John Lennon was a fan of Ray Kerouac, who was a big player within the beat movement.
Yes, definitely.
And Billy, as Paul McCartney, collaborated with Allen Ginsberg. So we could see here that we have the Beatles tied into this beat movement. So beat movement, B-E-A-T. Then we have Beatles, B-E-A-T-L-E-S. So the Beatles were really a result of the beat movement. So look at you have the Frankfurt School, we have Tavistock. They create the beat movement. The beat movement then segues into, we start getting into rock and roll, and it moves right into, connects itself right into the Beatles. And the Beatles also, the beetle is also the scarab beetle from Egyptian mythology, which is in reference from an Egyptian mythology perspective, is talking about enlightenment. So the Beatles are also put into a position of enlightenment. This brings in Aleister Crowley as well. So let's just for a moment, let me pause here for a second and just make a tie that maybe might not be so obvious. Crowley talked about his eons. He said back in the early 1900s, he claimed that that's when the eon of Horus was coming into play. Before that, it was the eon of Osiris. And the eon of Osiris, or the age of Pisces, was about oppression. It was about being shackled. It was about not pursuing your true or pure will. You were bound by societal dogma. And then he said, when things shift and transition over to the eon of Horus, that's when man becomes unshackled. That's when you can follow your pure and true will. So think about what Crowley is teaching, his tenets of Thelema. Thelema is his religion. And by the way, his religion was founded on April 8th of 1904. And we recently had the solar eclipse on April 8th of 2024.
Wow, yeah.
So the reason why that was played up so much in the media, my opinion, is because it was celebrating the 120th year of the religion of Thelema, which I have concluded is the primary spiritual and philosophical belief system of the controllers within the pyramid of power. Crowley's belief system plays a very, very big part in what it is they believe. And again, it's the worship of Lucifer.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we have the beat movement that attaches itself to the Beatles. And so the Beatles, as a creation of Tavistock, with the strong ties back to the Frankfurt School, in particular Theodore Adorno, they were created in order to further the dismantling of traditional values and institutionalized religion. So when you think about the Beatles, it started off innocent enough, but then it quickly progresses. And what did the Beatles represent? The Beatles represent anti-establishment. They dressed very differently. The music was very different. The way they presented themselves is in interviews, they were quippy. They would push back at the reporters, what would be perceived as the stagnant, stoic establishment press at the time. And going back even to some of the songs, let me throw this out there. And by the way, when I say this, folks, I am not a prude, okay? I'm just gonna, it's something you need to think about, okay? So the Beatles' first album, released on March 22nd of 1963, March 22nd is 322. It's the Skull and Bones number. Also, it's tied back to Genesis 322. And the reason why it goes back to Genesis 322, it's because it's saying, hey, the Bible's saying, because they know this now, they could be like gods, and we can't have that. But the controlling system They're saying, no, we're going to have that. We're going to have that. We're going to be gods. We hear it all the time. Aleister Crowley said every man and woman is a star, which means every man and woman is their own individual who develops their individuality, and then they become gods. Because in his book 77, he says, there is no God other than man. So their first album, think of the song, Please Please Me. Please please me like I please you. It's sexual innuendo. Even this very, very, very basic rock and roll song going back, it's there. There is this, it's implied. Please please me like I please you. What does he mean like that? How do I please you? Well, there's many ways to please somebody, but there are ways to please somebody, right? Also, think of the song, I Saw Her Standing There. She was just 17, if you know what I mean.
Yep. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, because one of the things I did leading up to our chat right now was I just started going through Paul McCartney interviews, right? He has an interview on GQ magazine, whatever, it's on YouTube. And he brings up that song and he goes, oh yeah, this was the original lyric was whatever it is. And, whatever he says it was, but she was just 17, if you know what I mean. And he said, but you guys probably don't know what I mean. And so that's the general perception of these people, obviously in power, that people don't understand what you mean, but we do. And that's kind of the thing that's continuously been hitting me as we've been talking, is this underlying sexual innuendo through all of the programs that we see. And now we see all this gender bending, which has been pushed on everybody. That was, implied since the Beats, all of this stuff. You know what I mean? There's so much underlying just gender bending, and it's crazy when you look at it like that.
Sexual deviation, I'll put it that way, is very, very high on their list of things that needed to be implemented in order to dismantle the current societal structures. Here, this is Eric Fromm, is from the Frankfurt School. He said he was an active advocate of the matriarchal theory. In other words, get the man out of the way, get the masculine out of the way. Masculinity and femininity, he claimed, were not reflections of essential sexual differences, as the Romantics had thought, but were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined. Okay? Wow. So what he's saying is gender is irrelevant. You only pay attention to your gender because societal norms and traditions make you aware of them. It's really, let me just see if I have something here, Michelle. I think I have a rundown of their list of, here it is, a list of what they were going after and looking to impose into society in order to break it apart. The creation of racial differences, a racial divide. Check mark, right?
Yep.
Continual change to create confusion. The teaching of sex and homosexuality to children. The undermining of the schools and the teachers' authority. And by the way, if anybody who's interested, this is the Frankfurt School. I got this off of Henry Mackow's website. And it goes a lot deeper with a lot more links, but this is just a summary. Huge immigration to destroy identity. The thing you have to understand about the controllers, the elites, in no way are they looking to destroy their identity. Their bloodlines are preserved. So in their minds, breaking all this down, look at it as in their minds they're thinking, we're going to dilute all of this. So there won't be any affinity towards your ancestral heritage or traditions.
Bingo.
Your traditions and your heritage is going to be associated with pop culture. Pop culture is the result of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. That's the culture you have today. They created that. That's the culture that most people embrace, and that's the culture that most people live in and abide by. The promotion of excessive drinking, the emptying of churches, an unreliable legal system with bias against the victims of a crime, creating dependency on the state or state benefits, dumbing down people through the media, and encouraging the breakdown of the family.
Yep, and here we are.
and here we are. So that was the long road, a long and winding road to get to your question about what do you see today, what's going on coming out of the work. Well, in order to see what you see today coming out of the work, you have to understand the blueprint. What was the planning? Who was planning this stuff? What was the strategy? How were they going to implement the strategy? And so the music and entertainment business is a huge tool in the toolbox of the controllers. And the Beatles are a big, big tool in that toolbox. I explain to my audience that the Beatles are foundational to all of the genres that were created by the Tavistock Institute, starting with them going forward. Each genre of music, punk, glam, metal, hard rock, techno, rap, hip hop, all of that is created in order to address the next grouping, segment, or generation of people to get them conditioned to be where the controllers want the public to be. They want them marching along single file. And at the end of the day, they want to homogenize society. In Memoirs, it tells us that what they're looking for at the end of the day is a population of literalists. People who believe in and abide by their ideology, their philosophies, their spiritual beliefs. And if you're not one of those people, if you're an outlier, then you're going to be a slave. And Crowley in his book 77 spells it out. Those, based on paraphrasing here, but those that are not with us shall be our slaves. Another thing I want to mention about Crowley is I get a lot of, not a lot, but every once in a while people will say, no, you're misunderstanding what Crowley's saying. When, his age of Horus is for everybody. I'm like, no, it's not for everybody. Crowley is not talking to the profane. He is not talking to the average Joe or Jane in the street. Crowley was part of the elite establishment. He worked for British intelligence back during World War I. So his religion of Thelema is talking to the elites. It's talking to the adepts. It's talking to the initiates. That's the category. That's the classification that they put themselves in. So the Beatles were a big part of changing the societal and cultural landscape. See, a lot of people have trouble with that because the Beatles have been around so long, and we've been so conditioned and indoctrinated with the Beatles story, and they've been the soundtrack to so many people's lives that it's that slow boiling frog thing. I was part of that, Michelle. I was part of that. It wasn't until I woke up and saw what was going on. But the Beatles, they brought in rock music. And after the Beatles came out, how many guys and girls went out? They formed bands, bought guitars, bought drums, bought basses, bought amplifiers. And, the British invasion. So when you think about the British invasion, the world's control system, at the end of the day, makes its way back up through Britain, through London, the inner city of London, through the Crown. Where is Tavistock? Tavistock is in London. The British invasion. It's the invasion of traditional values, traditional institutionalized religion. That is what that was all about. So they created this genre of music, and it's all about presentation, Michelle.
Mikey, you still here?
I'm still here. Yeah, you froze on me.
Okay. All right. I'm here too.
I can hear you though. Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, we're back. Okay.
Okay.
Presentation is very important because a lot of people will argue with me and say, well, are you saying all these bands, they don't play their own music? I said, nope, never said that. I never said that. Never said that. I even said that the Beatles can play their instruments. The Beatles just weren't skilled enough to take it to the studio and be on the recorded tracks. Based upon my research, that's where I landed. But the Beatles created an entire environment of musicians that studied their music and became very good musicians. They became songwriters. They formed bands. They recorded. So it was the catalyst that got the ball rolling on all of this. And it's presentation. So when we take a look at, back in the 1960s, when I say presentation, it's the appearance. How did they dress? It's the clothing. It's the hair. It's the beards. It's the symbolism, the occult symbolism on the album covers.
Oh, yeah.
That's the presentation. It's the drugs. It's the alcohol. It's the free love. That's the presentation that was brought into everybody's living room in magazines and books, and it was everywhere in the movie theaters. That was to shape people. That was to break down the current system, the paradigms of the current social and cultural systems, and to get things going. And the Beatles were instrumental in that. And like I said earlier in the show, they brought in the psychedelic era with Sgt. Pepper and the Summer of Love. And by the way, Billy, who plays the part of Paul McCartney, along with John Phillips, was behind the Monterey Pop Festival, where the local police were told to stand down as the CIA handed out LSD to those who attended the festival. And why? Because they were experimenting. They wanted to see what would happen. So, and also, I know I'm going on a lot here, but a lot of people will say to me, well, drugs make you more creative. That's wrong. You have bought into the indoctrination, the propaganda.
Right.
If drugs were good for your creativity, then why have so many bands that got sucked into the black hole of drugs and alcohol decide to come clean? Why did they pull themselves out of that ditch if that all of that is supposed to make you more creative? That's a fallacy that you have been brainwashed to believe. In fact, in the book, Billy tells us that at his recording sessions, there is no drugs. Musicians that show up, they're clean because they have to have their faculties to make sure that the recording comes off well. So in any case.
That's a great point, actually, the whole drug thing, because ultimately, I mean, it's really just a distraction from self. And that's what all of this is. It's literally a distraction from ourselves, from our sacred center, taking us away from knowing our own innate power, which is what, in my opinion, what the controllers really want us to stay away from is understanding actually how powerful we really are. And
that's right.
And drugs, alcohol, all these vices that we have at our disposal now definitely take our power away as well, because it takes you, it removes your sense of self. Obviously, it makes you more suggestible. It allows you to be more relaxed with things you shouldn't be relaxed with. And, one of the things before we start really wrapping up here, that I wanted to bring to you and see if you are interested in, not interested in, if you've heard of the comedy scene that's going on in Austin, Texas. right now. If you have
No.
know anything about, well, we are pretty big comedy fans, and we watch it from the aspect of like knowing that this is gets kind of like our distraction, I would call it.
Yeah.
But basically, going on right now in Austin, Texas, is a huge exodus of comedians who have been moving from LA or all different parts of the United States, typically New York, LA. There's this huge exodus into Austin, Texas that's been going on since C19, basically. And Joe Rogan was the first one to actually initiate this. So Joe Rogan moved his show and his studio from LA to Austin, and now it is just one other, all these comedians, it's all happening in Austin, Texas. And we've been talking about it in the sense of that it's a lot like what happened in the 60s in San Francisco and in Laurel Canyon. There's this huge hub going on. And to me, it speaks to a lot of the same themes that we're talking about today, just the degenerate nature of it, late night, lots of alcohol, lots of
Yeah.
drugs, lots of sex. Obviously everyone likes to laugh. Who doesn't want to laugh? It's wonderful. As I said, I'm a fan of comedy, but we're watching this with the lens of eyes to see, I guess you could say. And so I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on that and see if you've looked into that at all. But if you haven't, I suggest you do, because Alex Jones hands in this as well. There's all this stuff going on, and it's really interesting. We're seeing a lot of the same sort of Laurel Canyon programming in the comedian scene, and it's just something to be aware of, I suppose. There's a main comedy club that just opened by this guy named Red Band, and he's kind of like, he's been a producer. He was Joe Rogan's original producer, actually, and his comedy club is called the Sunset Strip Comedy Club. And so there's all this crossover of lingo too that's happening, and it's just really interesting to kind of see it going down.
It's the creation of Pied Pipers.
Yes.
This is what they do. So I know we're really short on time, but let me explain this real quick. So the whole mindset of cultural Marxism is also tied into the cult of Pan.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look, and the Pied Piper is a play on Pan, right? The Pied Piper leads the children out, right? And then he's playing his flute. Look at the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album cover. The Beatles are in multicolored outfits. In fact, the entire album is multicolored, but look at their outfits. Pied means multicolored. The Beatles are the Pied Pipers, leading their followers with their music to the Aeon of Horus, to the Age of Aquarius, to the end state that the controllers are looking to their goal line, which I think they think they're going to have everything sewn up on January 1st of the 22nd century. I mean, this is just a thought in my mind that they've got this thing planned out, and they've got control points like 2030 as an example, right? 2030 is just a stop along their timeline of pushing the agenda forward. They'll have an agenda 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070. But the Beatles are the Pied Pipers. And take a look at the instruments that the Beatles are holding on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. They are wind instruments.
Ah, yeah.
Pan.
Right.
The Pied Piper. So, and I mean, I could get into Pan too, but I know we're short on time. So that's a lot of what's going on behind the scenes that the Beatles are a part of. It's important to understand that the Beatles are part of a much larger picture, although they play a very significant role in that agenda. They were very, very key to kicking off the counterculture back in the early 1960s, and the Frankfurt School and Tavistock, very, very successful, very successful. I could vouch for it because all I have to do is take a look at the comment section and how many people absolutely don't want to hear what I have to say about the Beatles because it's a religion. It's another ism. And, like I said, they create Pied Pipers and people follow.
Wow, indeed. Man, Mike, this was excellent. Thank you so much for imparting all this wisdom. This has been a really good conversation and just really grateful to have had some of your time.
You're very welcome, Michelle. Maybe we could do a part 2 at some point. And there's just so much to this thing. I'm doing a documentary with Jay, as I mentioned, and I told him there's so many touch points. I don't even know how we can get the documentary done.
Oh yeah, that'll be really exciting though. I definitely hope that all plays out and comes to fruition, because I think that a lot of people too, I do think, as much as I see people wanting to avoid these truths and this and that and the other thing, I do think there's more people that are becoming more open to understanding that there is something weird going on. And I just don't think, like, everyone isn't meant to see this stuff. It's just like how it is, just like with everything in life. Some people are going to get it. Some people aren't ready for it. Some people, their mind isn't even like close to being able to wrap themselves around it. So I just feel grateful for being one of the people that have been able to see the light, honestly, because it's been such a helpful thing in my life in so many ways. It's one of the reasons why I call my show The Healing Home, because learning this information, what we're talking about today, has been so freaking healing for me. And it is accelerated my ability to heal and to help others heal, because when you can see this stuff, things start to make so much more sense. As crazy as it can make you feel, you just see life through a different lens, and it's really helpful. So kudos. Thank you for doing all you do. It's valuable work and it's much needed, really. So
it's
I honor
probably going
you.
to kill me.
Oh man, I hope not, man.
No, I mean from exhaustion.
Oh, oh, I get it. Yeah, I mean, it is, this kind of stuff is really, it's not for the faint of heart. That's for the truth. So please tell everyone where they can find you. I will also have all your links in the description of this video down below. But if you have any parting words or that you'd like to share with the audience, the floor is yours, sir. Thank you again, and I wish you the best.
Well, thank you, Michelle. To take a look at my work, my music, just go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com. All the links are there, all the platforms, Reverb Nation, SoundCloud, where my music is. Just head over there. And if you're interested in the Beatles, go to my Paul is Dead channel, my Beatles channel. The link is there, and you can start taking a look. I have 300 videos up, Michelle.
Wow, 300. I did see too that you had put a post up maybe last month about there's been 5 million views on that's crazy. I mean, that is such a huge milestone.
Over the 8 years, 5 million views or listens to all of the material. And how do I come up with that number? I just go to 2 of my channels. I go to my main channel, Sage of Quay, and I go to my Paul is Dead channel. And the Paul is Dead channel is very easy. You just go to your About You page, and it tells you how many views there have been. And then for my other channel, I've got to count them up. So it's just those 2 channels. It's more than 5 million, actually, because I don't count in Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute.
Oh, man.
I want to keep it conservative because I want to because there's always somebody out there, that's going to say, it can't be 5 million. Well, it is 5 million. So, yeah, it's quite amazing. It really is.
Man, well, that's awesome. Glad to see it. Glad to hear it. And I would love to have you back for a part 2 at some point. So we can talk about that at some other time. But until next time, thank you, everyone, for being here with us, and enjoy the rest of your day, Mike.
You too, Michelle.
All right. See you soon. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Healing Home. For all things Michelle's Healing Home, as always, head to michelleshealinghome.com. Thank you to all the patrons out there. You guys are awesome, and the support that you show is very much appreciated. For all people who want to join me over there on Patreon, patreon.com/thehealinghome is where you can go to do that. A handbook for herbal and natural cat care is now and still available. Really pumped about this offering, as I always say, but head to my website if you're interested. You can download and purchase this ebook for $11, and then you can have it on hand to help implement natural and herbal remedies into your cat's life. I am also actively revising this ebook, so I'm going to be having a brand new version coming out towards the end of the summer. My full moon offering newsletter, you can sign up for that over at michelleshealinghome.com underneath the newsletter tab. You can also check out all my old archived issues if you'd like to do that as well over there. And my current full moon offering is number 45, my mugwort skincare. Still available are all 3 products that you see on the screen: my mugwort and rose facial toner, mugwort earth hag soap, and my earthy glow facial oil. All of the prices for those and all other items that I have currently available are up on the screen right now. So you can check out michelleshealinghome.com. Underneath the store tab is where you'll be able to purchase any of these items. And you can also always inquire with me about custom orders for bulk purchasing. Next full moon offering newsletter is coming out on 6/21, right around the summer solstice. So look for that. And if you haven't already signed up for the newsletter, as I said, you can do so at michelleshealinghome.com underneath the newsletter tab. Next week's episode, we're going to be talking Mother Mary with the Henlin sisters. Mario is also going to be joining us for this talk, and we are very, very excited to have these 2 lovely ladies join us next week. Both of them are very symbolically literate and intelligent, and we know them through a handful of friends in the Portland area, actually, and they have been doing on their social media what they're calling 100 Days of Mary, and they have been posting all about Mary, her symbolism, what she means to them, and their understanding of Mary and why she's important. We're also going to be talking with Mary Henlin, who is also known as Portland Mary, who is a wonderful artist who is using Mary and the Dark Madonna to express herself through her art. So we're going to get into all of that with these 2 ladies on the 25th of June at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the Healing Home. Mario has now released the second part of his Symbolic Secrets series with the Magician. So this is over there on Patreon. It's an exclusive offer for patrons and also paid members who are supporting him through his website. So you can sign up for this Symbolic Secrets series over at symbolicstudies.com. So you can do so directly through the website, or you can also head to patreon.com/symbolicstudies, where you can also sign up. All the tiers of support begin at $5, and Mario just has been having a lot of fun doing this, and it is a really deep dive into the major arcana of the tarot. So if you're interested in that and really like where Mario comes from symbolically, head on over to patreon.com/symbolicstudies or symbolicstudies.com. And with all that said, folks, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Thank you so much again for being here. Thanks for hanging out here till the end to hear all the updates. And until next time, take care out there. We'll see you soon.